The planet Asteron 9 was slowly dying. Once it had been a world full of peace and beauty. Tall silver trees grew across its valleys, their glowing leaves lighting the night. The skies shimmered with blue light as the Lunari, a race of gentle winged beings, glided above their crystal cities. They were known across nearby systems for their kindness and their music that carried through the air like soft rain. For centuries, they had no need for armies or weapons. Their people lived in balance with their world and trusted the stars to remain kind. But peace does not last forever. One day, without warning, the Draxian war clans arrived. The Draxians were a brutal species, famous for their raids and slavery. They came from the dark edges of the galaxy, where violence was the only law. Their ships were huge black monsters of metal, moving through space like sharks through water. When they reached Asteron 9, they didn't send messages or warnings. They began firing. Cities that had stood for centuries were burned to ashes in minutes. The sky that once glowed silver now filled with smoke and flame. The Lunari, who had never fought a war, had no idea what to do. Panic spread through their people. Families ran into the forest, clutching children and small bags of food. The Draxians followed, hunting them from the air. Whole villages disappeared overnight. The sound of wings, once beautiful, became a sign of fear as survivors tried to flee. In their desperation, the Lunari gathered what little technology they had and sent a call for help into the stars. An SOS signal that repeated endlessly through the void. "Please," the message said, translated into hundreds of languages. "This is Asteron 9. We are under attack. We need aid." Every hour they watched their scanners, waiting for an answer, but the stars stayed silent. The nearby civilizations heard the signal but ignored it. Some were too far to help. Others were too afraid of the Draxians. The Lunari had no military, no defenses, and now no hope. Days turned into weeks, and every day the Draxian fleet grew closer to complete victory. Saren Val, one of the last leaders of the Lunari Council, stood in the ruins of their capital. The once shining towers now lay broken. Fires burned endlessly, and the air smelled of smoke and dust. Around her, survivors huddled in fear. Their eyes were dull, their wings covered in ash. Every few hours the signal was sent again, and again it returned with silence. "Someone will hear us," Saren whispered, her voice trembling more with hope than belief. Someone will come. But deep down, even she began to doubt. What kind of people would risk their own lives to save strangers from another world? Who would fight the Draxians when so many had failed before? She walked through the ruins of their city, past broken statues and fallen bridges, and wondered if this was how her world would end, not with an explosion, but with quiet hopelessness. Children cried at night, asking if the stars were listening. Parents told stories of heroes and faraway protectors just to help them sleep. Yet, with each sunrise, fewer voices answered those cries. The Draxians destroyed communication towers, poisoned rivers, and turned forests into black ash. They didn't just want victory. They wanted to erase Asteron 9 from history. In the command center, the few remaining engineers kept the SOS signal running, though they knew it might never be answered. The message drifted across empty space, passing silent moons and dead worlds. Somewhere out there it might reach someone, or it might just vanish into the endless dark. No one knew. Saren often looked at the stars through the cracks in the ceiling. They used to make her feel safe. Now they only reminded her how alone they were. But one night, as the fires burned lower and the sounds of war echoed from far away, she looked up and whispered, "Please, let someone hear us." Her words were carried away by the wind, but the universe has strange ways of listening. Unknown to her, that signal had already reached a distant corner of the galaxy, a place the Lunari had never heard of, a place the Draxians whispered about with fear. It reached Earth. The humans had heard the SOS, but the Lunari didn't know that yet. To them, the silence meant the end. They thought their message had been lost forever. They thought help would come, perhaps from their neighbors or old allies. They imagined gentle ships bringing medicine and hope. They imagined rescue, peace, and kindness. As the Draxians tightened their grip, the last Lunari cities fell one by one. Their skies turned black from smoke and the rivers ran with ash. The people gathered in caves and ruins, praying to stars that didn't answer. Saren kept sending the call, her voice shaking as she repeated the same words again and again. Even when the transmitters began to fail, even when power ran low, she didn't stop. It was the last thing she could do, to hope. And then, one final night, as Asteron 9 burned, the signal went out once more. No one knew that far away. Deep in the cold void, human satellites had already picked it up. No one knew that the message had been forwarded, analyzed, and taken seriously by beings far different from the Lunari. While the Lunari cried for help, Earth had already begun to move. But for now, Asteron 9 remained a planet under siege, dying, alone, and waiting. The Lunari huddled beneath shattered skies, whispering prayers for a miracle that might never come. Every flicker in the dark sky made them look up, wondering if it was another Draxian ship or maybe, just maybe, someone finally answering their call. They had no idea that the kind of help coming for them was not the one they imagined. They thought gentle diplomats or aid ships might appear, bringing peace and comfort. Instead, something else was on its way. Something born from a world where survival meant strength, where every challenge was met with fire and will. The Lunari had called for help. And help was coming, but not the kind they expected. The war on Asteron 9 had turned into a nightmare. The Draxian armada filled the skies, their dark ships blotting out the sun. Everywhere the Lunari looked, destruction followed. Whole continents burned. Forests that once glowed with light were turned into wastelands of smoke and ash. The sound of explosions echoed across valleys, and the air was thick with the smell of metal and fire. The Draxians didn't just want victory. They wanted to erase the Lunari completely, to make their planet nothing more than a black mark on the map of the stars. The few Lunari ships that tried to escape never made it past the upper atmosphere. The Draxians hunted them like sport. Every refugee transport that rose from the surface was tracked and destroyed before it could reach space. Families desperate to flee watched helplessly as the sky lit up with the burning remains of their ships. For those on the ground, hope was disappearing fast. Every day brought new reports. Another city lost, another region silent, another 1,000 lives gone. The once beautiful world was now a graveyard in slow motion. In the heart of the last surviving city stood what remained of the council chamber. Once it had been a hall of glass and light, where the Lunari leaders discussed art, culture, and peace. Now it was a broken ruin. The ceiling had collapsed and half the walls were gone. Dust hung in the air, mixed with the faint hum of damaged energy generators. The only sound that broke the silence was a repeating message, the same SOS, still being transmitted into the void. Saren Val, the last leader of the Lunari Council, stood among the ruins. Her once silver wings were blackened with soot, and her white robes were torn. In her trembling hands she held a communicator, replaying the same distress call over and over. Each time she pressed the button, her own voice echoed through the empty hall. "This is Asteron 9, we are under attack. We need help. Please, anyone, help us." And every time there was no reply, only static. Behind her, a few engineers tried to keep the signal station running. The power core was failing, and parts of the transmitter had melted in earlier bombardments. But they refused to stop. Sending the signal was all they had left, their last link to the universe. If they stopped calling for help, it would mean admitting defeat. Saren walked to the shattered window, looking out over what was once the capital city. Fires burned in the distance, painting the night sky orange. In the streets below, survivors moved like shadows, searching for food, water, or anyone still alive. She could hear distant gunfire. The Draxians were advancing again. They had already taken the southern districts. It was only a matter of time before the city fell completely. Her advisor, a young officer named Rathan, rushed into the room, covered in dust. "Counselor, the enemy has reached the defense perimeter. We can't hold them much longer." Saren nodded slowly, her expression empty. "Keep the signal running," she said softly. "As long as it sends, there's still a chance." Rathan hesitated. "With respect, my lady, no one is coming. The signal has been out there for weeks. If someone was going to answer, they would have by now." Saren turned toward him, her eyes filled with something that was not quite anger, not quite despair. "We don't stop hoping," she whispered. "If we stop hoping, we're already dead." Outside, thunder rumbled, but it wasn't from a storm. The Draxians had begun orbital bombardment again. Great beams of energy rained down from their ships, striking the ground and sending shockwaves through the city. The chamber shook, dust falling from what was left of the ceiling. The engineers ducked, shielding their equipment. One shouted, "Power is dropping. We'll lose the signal if this keeps up." And then, something strange happened. On the radar screens, an unusual reading appeared. Faint at first, like background noise. The technician frowned, tapping the console. "What's this?" he murmured. The readings grew stronger, faster, repeating in a pattern that didn't match any known Draxian formation. He called out, "Counselor Val, you need to see this." Saren hurried over. The display showed massive subspace distortions, ripples in the fabric of space itself. They were forming just outside Asteron 9's orbit, dozens of them. Each distortion was big, bigger than any Draxian ship. "What is it?" Rethan asked, his voice tense. "Reinforcements?" Saren stared at the data, her heart sinking. "It must be," she said quietly. "The Draxians have sent more ships." The thought crushed what little hope remained. If the Draxians were bringing reinforcements, it was over. They had already lost everything. More enemies would mean total annihilation. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a silent prayer to the stars. Outside, the people saw flashes of light in the sky, strange ripples spreading across the clouds. Many believed it was the end, the final strike. Then the first ship appeared. It tore through the distortion like a blade through water. The Lunari watched from the surface as a massive shape broke into real space, sleek, dark, and made of black metal. Its hull shimmered under the dying sun. For a second, no one knew what they were looking at. More distortions opened, and one by one, dozens of ships emerged behind it. They moved in perfect formation, silent and menacing, their engines glowing blue. The Draxians, caught off guard, immediately began scanning the newcomers. In the council chamber, the technician's eyes widened. "These aren't Draxian ships," he whispered. "Their design, it doesn't match any known database." Saren leaned closer. The ships were enormous, but they lacked the curved, insect-like designs of Draxian vessels. These were angular, precise, built for efficiency, not intimidation. The scanner zoomed in, and then the data appeared on the screen. Human origin detected. Saren froze. She had heard of humans, distant creatures from a dangerous world called Earth. Deathworlders, some called them. A species that thrived on chaos, that had risen from a planet so hostile most life forms couldn't survive there. Stories about them were whispered across the stars, some calling them saviors, others calling them monsters. No one ever expected to actually see them. Her voice trembled. "Humans," and they answered. Outside, the Draxians didn't wait. Their ships turned and opened fire on the newcomers, unleashing volleys of plasma and missiles. But the human fleet didn't move to dodge. Instead, their ships turned slightly, forming a battle line. And then the void exploded with light. A storm of railgun fire and guided projectiles filled space. The Draxian front line shattered instantly. In seconds, the sky above Asteron 9 became a war zone. From the surface, the Lunari watched in disbelief. Bright lines of fire cut across the sky, each one a human weapon striking true. The Draxian fleet, the monsters who had destroyed their world, was now burning. One of their massive flagships split apart, falling into the planet's atmosphere as a burning wreck. The humans didn't speak. They didn't send messages or warnings. They simply fought, fast, precise, and ruthless. Inside the council chamber, Saren watched the radar as the Draxian signals began to vanish one after another. The technician whispered, almost afraid to believe it. "They're winning. They're actually winning." Tears filled Saren's eyes. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. "They came," she said softly. "Someone came." But deep inside, as she stared at the human ships tearing through the Draxian armada, she felt something else too. Something between awe and fear. These were not gentle rescuers or peaceful explorers. They were warriors, born from a world that knew nothing but struggle. The kind of help that had arrived was not what the Lunari had imagined. They had thought help would come. Instead, humanity came with a fleet. When the human fleet arrived, they did not come with words or greetings. There were no messages, no warnings, no promises of peace. The stars simply tore open, and from that silence came war. The Lunari, watching from the surface of their dying planet, saw ships unlike anything they had ever imagined. They were dark and sharp-edged, built for battle, not beauty. Each vessel carried the symbol of a blue and white planet, Earth, and the name that would soon echo across the galaxy, United Earth Defense Command. At first, the Lunari thought maybe the humans would try to speak to the Draxians to find some peaceful end. After all, that was how most advanced species acted. They opened communication channels, demanded surrender, or tried to negotiate a truce. But the humans did none of that. They didn't speak at all. They just came, and then they struck. Without hesitation, the fleet shifted formation. Their engines flared like miniature suns lighting the void. The Draxians, unprepared for this kind of response, scrambled to reposition. But before they could even lock on to the human ships, hundreds of kinetic missiles launched at once. To the Lunaries' eyes, it was like a storm of light. Thousands of glowing trails streaked across space, cutting through the darkness like falling stars. Moments later, the first explosions bloomed, vast white flashes that turned the night sky into day. From the surface, it looked like gods had come down to punish the wicked. The Draxian ships, massive armored monsters that had once filled the Lunari with terror, began to explode one after another. Human weapons didn't use plasma or lasers like most alien species. They used kinetic energy, projectiles moving so fast that they hit with the force of small suns. Each impact tore through Draxian armor like paper, breaking their mighty ships apart piece by piece. The Lunari stood outside their shelters, staring upward in disbelief. For weeks they had lived under the shadow of those Draxian ships. Now in a single hour that shadow was burning away. One child pointed at the sky, shouting with awe as the bright lines crossed overhead. The older ones didn't know whether to cheer or to hide. What they saw was terrifying and beautiful all at once, a kind of destruction so precise it almost felt divine. Inside the human command ship UES Valiant, everything was calm. There were no shouts, no chaos, just soldiers working with cold focus. Target lock confirmed, one officer said quietly. Fire control ready. Execute, replied the admiral, his voice steady. And so they did. The Draxians tried to fight back. Their ships turned, weapons flaring with red plasma firing wild volleys into the dark. But the humans didn't move like other fleets. They didn't dance or dodge. They moved with purpose, clean, efficient, and terrifyingly direct. Every turn was calculated. Every missile found its mark. The Draxians' plasma bolts hit empty space, striking nothing. The humans, on the other hand, never missed. In the control center on Asteron 9, Saren Val and her people watched the battle unfold through broken screens and cracked lenses. The radar was filled with signals, red blips for the Draxians, blue for the humans. The red ones were disappearing fast. They're winning, whispered one of the Lunari technicians, disbelief heavy in his voice. They're actually winning. Outside, pieces of Draxian ships began falling from orbit, burning through the atmosphere like meteors. Some crashed into the oceans. Others shattered in the high mountains. Every impact shook the ground, but for once the Lunari didn't feel fear. Each explosion meant another enemy gone. For the first time in weeks, they could breathe again. Still, the humans didn't slow down. They didn't respond to the Lunari's attempts to communicate. Every signal the Lunari sent was met with silence. The humans were not here to talk, they were here to end the war. In orbit, their ships fired in perfect rhythm, one after another. A rain of destruction so coordinated it felt like music. The terrible song of vengeance. Within a few hours, half the Draxian armada was gone. The survivors tried to retreat, but human interceptors were already waiting. Sleek arrow-shaped fighters darted through the debris, finishing off anything still moving. The Draxians sent a desperate message across all frequencies, demanding to know who these attackers were. They got no reply, only another volley of missiles. The Lunari could see the Draxian flagship, a massive vessel the size of a city, still holding position above the burning world. Its armor glowed red from the heat of near-constant impacts. Even damaged, it was powerful, still firing, still resisting. The Draxians refused to surrender. To them, retreat was shame. Death was better. But humanity had no intention of letting them escape. The admiral of the UES Valiant watched the tactical screen closely. Focus all rail batteries on the flagship, he ordered. I want it erased. Every gun on the human ships turned toward the same target. The space between them lit up with blinding light as round after round of solid metal projectiles were launched at near-light speed. The Draxian flagship tried to raise its shields, but they failed almost instantly. The impacts tore straight through its hull, ripping through decks, reactors, and weapon cores. The great warship that had terrorized entire systems began to break apart. Its engines exploded, sending waves of debris scattering into orbit. From the ground, the Lunari saw the end. A great sphere of fire appeared in the sky, so bright it could be seen even through the smoke clouds. It grew larger, then faded, leaving behind thousands of glowing fragments that orbited like dying stars. The Draxian flagship, The symbol of their power was gone. Only silence followed. For a long moment, no one spoke. The Lunari simply stared upward, too stunned to move. The world was quiet except for the distant rumble of falling debris. Then slowly people began to cry, and not from sadness but from disbelief and relief. After so much fear, the monsters who had destroyed their lives were finally gone. Saren Val stood at the cracked window of the council chamber, her eyes shining with reflected firelight. "They did it," she whispered. "They really did it." She could hardly understand it. These humans had arrived without a word, destroyed an entire invasion fleet in hours and said nothing. No demands, no communication, just silent absolute action. The Lunari had heard stories about humanity, how they came from a death world, a planet full of storms, predators, and poisons. Many believed that no creature could survive such a place, yet humans had not only survived, they had learned to thrive. Now, seeing them in action, Saren understood what those stories meant. They were a people forged in hardship. Everything about them, their ships, their weapons, their silence, spoke of a species that had learned long ago that mercy alone could not always save the innocent. In the dark sky above, the last of the Draxian ships exploded, scattering like dust. The human fleet began to reform, moving into perfect alignment again. Not a single ship drifted out of position. Even in victory, they were controlled, disciplined, unshaken. To the Lunari, it looked almost unnatural, an army that fought not for rage or revenge, but for precision, for duty. As the debris slowly fell toward the planet, it looked like a strange rain, tiny burning pieces of metal glowing against the blackness of space. The Draxian flagship's remains circled Asteron 9, forming a faint halo that shimmered like ash around a dying star. It was a haunting sight, one that would be remembered for generations. The Lunari had prayed for salvation. They had imagined peace ships and kind ambassadors, but what they received was far greater and far more terrifying, a fleet that fought like gods of war. And in that moment, every survivor on Asteron 9 understood something they would never forget. When humanity answers a call for help, they do not come to talk. They come to end the threat. When the battle finally ended, the skies above Asteron 9 were no longer filled with fire. Only drifting smoke remained, rising slowly into the thin air like ghosts of the war that had just passed. The great Draxian armada was gone, nothing left but silent wreckage falling from orbit, glowing like faint stars as it burned through the atmosphere. The world was broken, scarred, and burning in many places, but one truth cut through all the destruction. The Lunari were still alive. For the survivors, it felt unreal. Hours earlier, they had been certain the end had come. They had waited for death, hiding in shattered buildings and underground shelters, listening to the thunder of bombardments. Now that terrible noise was gone. The sky was quiet except for the faint hum of engines, not Draxian ones, but something new. Massive shadows passed over the ruined cities, blocking the sun for a moment. When the Lunari looked up, they saw human ships descending. The humans did not arrive with banners or marching troops. They came with precision and calm, landing quietly in the ruined fields and on the outskirts of the destroyed cities. Their landing craft opened, and soldiers stepped out in armor marked with the same blue and white insignia the Lunari had seen on the warships above. These were not conquerors. Their movements were measured, deliberate. They scanned the surroundings, set up camps, and began unloading supplies. At first, the Lunari were afraid. After all, this new species had just destroyed an entire fleet in a few hours. Their weapons had shaken the planet itself. What kind of people could do that? Were they here to claim the planet now? To rule what was left? But as the first groups of humans approached, their actions told a different story. One human medic knelt beside a wounded Lunari child, gently lifting her with strong but careful hands. He said something softly, his voice calm, though the words were strange and unfamiliar. Another soldier opened a crate and began handing out food packs, dry, compact rations that smelled strange but warm. A group of engineers set up portable generators and lights, bringing power back to dark shelters where survivors huddled in silence. They worked quickly, efficiently, without asking for anything in return. Within hours, makeshift hospitals appeared. Human doctors, assisted by small floating drones, moved from patient to patient, treating burns, sealing wounds, and giving medicine. The Lunari were confused. These beings who had rained destruction from the sky now moved with gentleness, their faces hidden behind visors, their voices quiet and steady. They weren't here to dominate. They were here to help. Saren Val, the Lunari leader, walked among the ruins of her city when she saw a human commander giving orders to his team. His armor was scratched from battle, the Earth emblem still bright on his chest. She approached carefully, unsure if he would understand her, but before she could speak, he turned and nodded. "You are the leader?" he asked in clear but accented galactic trade language. She hesitated, then nodded. "We are. What's left of us," she said. Her voice trembled slightly. "You came. You saved us." The man looked at her for a long moment before replying. "We answered a call," he said simply. "That's what we do." There was no pride in his tone, no boast, only fact. And something else. A weight in his eyes that the Lunari couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't peace either. It was something quieter, deeper. A restrained fury that seemed always present, waiting beneath their calm exteriors. Even as they worked to rebuild, the humans carried it with them like a shadow. The Lunari began to notice it everywhere. When the soldiers moved through the ruins, their eyes scanned the horizon with constant alertness, as if expecting another attack. When they found the burned remains of Lunari homes, they paused for a moment, silent and still. No words, no outbursts, and only a quiet tension like a flame that refused to go out. To the Lunari, it felt as if the humans were mourning something invisible, not just for them, but for all the lives lost to cruelty in the galaxy. At night, the survivors gathered near the humans' campfires. They watched the strange Deathworlders eat their rations, repair their armor, and maintain their weapons. The flames flickered on their faces that looked both familiar and alien, marked by lines of exhaustion and focus. Some smiled softly when Lunari children approached, offering bits of dried fruit or warm water. Others sat in silence, staring into the fire, lost in thoughts they never spoke aloud. The Lunari could feel that these humans were not here for glory. They didn't celebrate their victory. They didn't take trophies or demand rewards. They didn't even stay near the capital's ruins long enough to build monuments or flags. Instead, they moved constantly, searching for survivors, clearing debris, setting up communication beacons to contact orbiting rescue ships. They treated their mission like duty, nothing more, nothing less. Saren noticed it most clearly when she tried to thank them formally. She had gathered what remained of the Lunari Council and offered words of gratitude to the human commander, even a ceremonial gift, a shard of crystal from the planet's ancient heart, a symbol of unity. The human refused it gently. "Keep it," he said. "Rebuild with it." "That's why we came." She was stunned. "You want nothing in return? Not even land? A trade agreement? Protection?" He shook his head. "We don't fight for payment. We fight because someone called for help. We hear those calls, and we answer." That answer stayed with her. In the following days, as she watched the humans continue their work, she began to understand why so many feared and respected them. Humanity did not seek power for its own sake. But when they were called, they came with unstoppable force. They didn't ignore distress because to them, indifference was the greatest crime. Yet beneath their compassion lay a dangerous truth. Humans never forgot those who caused such suffering. The Draxians had made a terrible mistake. They hadn't just attacked a peaceful planet. They had done it in front of a species that carried the memory of every hardship carved into their bones. The human silence was not mercy, it was judgment. They had come not out of hatred but out of principle, out of something that ran deeper than politics or alliances. To them, cruelty demanded a response. And that response was total. When the Lunari looked into human eyes, they saw kindness, but also fire. They saw a people who had learned to live on a world where nature itself tried to kill them every day. A people who had turned struggle into strength, who had learned that survival and compassion could exist together, but only through discipline and force when needed. The humans had saved them, yes, but they had also shown them the cost of that salvation. Days turned into weeks. The fires across Astron 9 began to fade, replaced by lights from new generators and rebuilt shelters. The human ships remained in orbit, serving as guardians while the planet began to heal. And yet, whenever Saren looked up at the sky and saw those dark vessels gliding among the stars, she felt both gratitude and awe, and a little fear. because she knew now what it truly meant to call for help from Earth. The Lunari would tell their children the story for generations, how the humans came, not as conquerors or saviors, but as something far more complex, beings driven by empathy and fury in equal measure. They didn't come for power. They came because someone had suffered injustice, and across the galaxy word would spread that the Draxians had made the ultimate mistake. They had drawn the attention of the Deathworlders, the children of a savage planet who answered distress calls not with words, but with fleets. Weeks passed after the great battle over Asteron 9, and the Lunari began to rebuild what was left of their shattered world. Their cities were broken, their fields burned, and their people wounded in body and spirit. But they were alive. And that, in itself, felt like a miracle. Every sunrise brought with it the sight of human and Lunari engineers working side by side, clearing rubble, repairing structures, and planting the first seeds of recovery. The sound of heavy machinery filled the air again, not for war this time, but for creation. Where once the smoke of destruction had darkened the skies, now plumes of dust rose from reconstruction. Human aid ships moved between the settlements, delivering food, medical supplies, and construction materials. The Lunari had never seen such efficiency. Every human team worked with relentless focus, as if time itself was their enemy. They didn't stay in one place long. Once a village was stable, they moved on to the next, leaving behind tools, energy cells, and hope. The Lunari soon realized that humanity's strength wasn't just in their weapons. It was in their discipline, their organization, and their sense of duty. Children followed the humans through the rebuilding zones, fascinated by their strange machines and calm, firm voices. Some soldiers even taught Lunari volunteers how to use the equipment, smiling quietly when the locals clumsily mimicked their actions. It was a strange sight. Deathworlders feared across the galaxy, showing patience and gentleness to a people who had once trembled at their arrival. Saren Val, the Lunari leader, often stood on the balcony of the temporary command center overlooking the ruins of her capital. Every night she would see the glow of human floodlights, the shapes of their soldiers moving through the dark, still guarding even after victory. She knew they would leave soon, and when they did, the planet would once again be in Lunari hands, rebuilt with human help, but strengthened by the lesson they had learned. Salvation always comes at a price, and strength must walk hand in hand with compassion. Then one quiet morning, the human ships began to ascend. Massive carriers rose through the atmosphere, their engines lighting up the sky like a second dawn. The people gathered in the streets and fields to watch. They waved, some in gratitude, others in awe as the fleet climbed higher and higher, disappearing into the stars. But before the last ship vanished, every screen, every comm beacon, every interstellar frequency in the sector suddenly activated. A message appeared, simple, clear, and spoken in a calm, human voice. It was the Admiral of the United Earth Defense Command. His image flickered across the skies, projected by the human satellite still orbiting Asteron 9. His words would be remembered forever. "When you cry for help," he said, his voice steady, echoing across space, "we answer. But understand this. When we come, we do not come in peace alone." For a moment, silence followed. Then the transmission ended. The human ships disappeared into subspace, vanishing without fanfare, leaving behind only the echo of that warning. The message spread through the networks of the galaxy like wildfire. Within hours, every major civilization had heard it. Within days, every empire was talking about it. Some called humanity heroes, the defenders of the helpless, the protectors of peace. They said that Earth's children had proven that compassion could still exist in a cold universe. Others were far less certain. To them, the humans were terrifying. A species too powerful, too decisive, too willing to wage war in the name of aid. They didn't just rescue, they destroyed anything that threatened those in need. They were saviors, yes, but saviors made of steel and fire. To some, that made them monsters. But regardless of opinion, no one could ignore the truth that had been made clear in the ashes of Asteron 9. When humanity answered a distress call, the balance of war changed forever. Their arrival meant that battles would not end in negotiation or surrender. They ended in finality. When the Death Worlders came, the war never ended the same way again. Entire fleets could vanish in hours. Empires trembled at the thought of what it would mean to face them, for their vengeance was not random. It was justice delivered with absolute precision. Across the galaxy, governments held secret meetings. Admirals reviewed defense strategies. Politicians argued over whether to welcome humanity as allies or to fear them as a new superpower. The galactic networks were filled with debates. Were human saviors or destroyers in disguise? But for the common people, for those who lived under threat from raiders, tyrants, and invaders, the answer was simpler. To them, the humans were hope. Terrifying, unstoppable hope. Back on Asteron 9, the Lunari continued to rebuild. The humans had left behind not only supplies and technology, but something far more powerful: inspiration. They had shown that mercy and might could coexist, that compassion did not mean weakness. The Lunari engineers began designing new defense systems modeled after human technology. Their scientists studied the aid equipment left behind, learning from it. Their soldiers trained harder, swearing they would never again be so helpless when danger came. The Lunari spirit, once broken, was now forged stronger than before. At night, when the twin moons rose and the sky cleared of smoke, the survivors would gather around the fires and tell the story of the day the humans came. Parents told their children of how the stars had burned with light when the Death Worlders arrived, and how the Draxian invaders, so feared and cruel, had been erased in hours. They spoke of the human soldiers who moved like thunder and spoke like calm rivers, of their eyes filled with quiet fury, and their hands steady in both battle and healing. And in time, this story grew into something more, a legend whispered in reverence and fear alike. A legend that carried a message more powerful than any fleet. It was said that once, long ago, when the Lunari were facing extinction, they sent a cry for help into the void. They waited, certain that no one would come. But then, the stars themselves answered. Out of the darkness came ships of iron and flame, bearing the emblem of a distant blue world. The invaders were destroyed, the planet saved, and the universe learned a new truth. When humanity comes, peace follows, but not before fire. Generations. Later, the Lunari still whispered the same final words that had spread across the stars. Words that summed up everything they had seen, everything they had learned. We thought help would come, they said. Humanity came instead. And even centuries later, whenever a distress signal echoed across the blackness of space, those words would remind every civilization what it truly meant to call for aid from the children of Earth. For they would come, fast, furious, and unyielding. And once they arrived, the galaxy itself would never be the same again.